and welcome to another evening of frank conversation here on Hard Copy, coming to you from our studios in Abuja. I'm Maokwe Ogun Yusuf. Last week, we spoke with investigative journalist and editor-in-chief of the FIJ, that's the Foundation for Investigative Journalism, Fisayo Soyombo, on his work investigating corruption in the Nigerian Customs Service, the NCS. We continue to wait on the NCS to give a response to the issues raised, particularly with regards to the Premium Times report detailing widespread malfeasance among top cadre of NCS officials. If you missed the interview, do watch on the links showing at the bottom of your screen. It's International Women's Day, so first, happy International Women's Day to all of our female viewers, and well done for all you do in moving our families and society forward. The program tonight is dedicated to women. But before the men watching this switch up and say, this doesn't concern me, he had a theme out first. This year, the United Nations is encouraging us to invest in women and accelerate progress. If we're all concerned about progress as a society, will we be willing to interrogate some of the ways that we have held back that progress through some of the everyday decisions that we make that have long-term impact, not only on our girls, but on society at large? I bet is we will. So join me tonight as I welcome our guest. Ayisha Osori is an accomplished lawyer, author, opinion writer, and a director at the Open Society Foundations, where she oversees ideas and fellowship collaborative. Ayisha, great to have you on this auspicious occasion of International Women's Day.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and happy International Women's Day to you and to obviously all our viewers as well.
Thank you very much. I'm just wondering, sometimes you think it's a little redundant to have a day or a month celebrating women?
Considering that this is, I think, the 113th episode of International Women's Day, and if you look at the indices, yeah, I might say that I think it's performative. Maybe not redundant, but it's definitely performative, because then we spend the whole day talking about it, and then everything moves on, and still very little changes. I mean, if you're looking at just financial inclusion, for example, in terms now that we're talking about investments, we have 25 million unbanked women in Nigeria, and the gender gap in terms of financial inclusion and services is actually widening in Nigeria as opposed to other parts of Africa where the gap is closing. So yeah, I do find it performative. I looked for what President Tinubu had said today, and very weak. Nothing exciting. So yeah, I agree. You could be right. Redundant, performative, definitely one of the above.
Well, you know, if you look at the issues, I mean, you just raised it. There might have been no other day for us to raise issues like this. You know, yes, it is. We do this almost every year now, or we do this every year, not almost every year. We do this every year, and you know, one will have to ask all the talk versus the impact it ought to be having. You know, when you look at there's a wide gap, there's a disparity. But nonetheless, I think that you know you have another year to take a look at it again and see what progress you should make. Do you think that there's anything that we can say over the years we have achieved from talking about it?
Well, I mean, definitely more awareness is always useful, and you never really know what knowledge is going to be useful at a particular time. So the fact that we're talking about it more, that many people, corporates, schools are engaging, they're having conversations, I think that's always useful. It's always useful to have that conversation. But then where does it go beyond the conversation, I think is where we should be asking. So we spent all of today, International Women's Day, talking about women and where we are, tying it to the theme of invest in women. But then beyond that, what is the reality? You know, is there a way, like, for example, I mean, we have a new Minister of Women Affairs. This would be her first International Women's Day. But I would say that maybe by next year, by the time the next International Women's Day rolls around, let that be an opportunity for her and her team to do a stock take that this is where we were on invested women in 2024. So yeah, it's useful to have these conversations. It's just that they can't stop at conversations. It needs to go beyond.
Well, as you've highlighted, the theme this year seems very straightforward. Invest in women, accelerate progress, like a solution and outcome sort of thing.
Absolutely.
You have to ask sometimes, how can something be so obvious, yet so difficult to implement?
Well, I mean, there's a lack of will, and many layers of complication, obviously. But there's nothing new. I think during Okonjo-Iweala's time, and I think this might be her second coming, because she had her first coming with Obasanjo and then the second coming with Jonathan. She had this smart women, smart economics, smart budgeting. There was a very catchy slogan that I can't remember. But it was also tied to this whole thing that, if you invest in women, that it makes sense when you have a budget to think about women, and then you'll be thinking about your community more holistically. So sometimes we keep reinventing the wheel, saying the same thing. But yes, this is nice and catchy, and it gives everybody a good sense that if you don't invest in half of your population, half of your community, then you're going to be, as they say, hanging on one side, heavy on one side, weak on the other side. Or to say another more obvious one, you can't clap with one hand. And so you have to strengthen both hands so that you can clap and make the music together. And I think so this for me is a message, not even so much for women, even though women are leading the conversations, it's also a message for the men. If there are men, in our society that are saying we want better public services, we want a better quality of life, we want a better society, then they should know that they should be investing in women. And that investment takes many different forms. It's not just financial. But yeah, it starts with the government and how it, allocates its budget towards women and girls.
Indeed, and it's certainly some place to interrogate. But I'm glad that you brought it home and you've given examples of how, this has been on for a while now with Mrs. Okonjo-Iweala bringing this to the fore. I am just wondering, what other places do you think that if we were to apply this theme, we could be getting we could be leapfrogging the outcomes that we see?
These days, I'm going to give an answer that's probably going to be uninspiring and tied to what President Tinubu said in his message. But education for me would be the surest way of leapfrogging, honestly. But then it's not just education and access to education. And you talk about access when you're talking about Nigeria because we have so many out-of-school children. We also talk about access when you talk about Nigeria because we also have many cultures where young girls are not considered worthy of school, so they're kept out. But beyond access, we also have to talk about the quality, like what are we actually teaching? So if we would review our educational curriculum and put in the right things that we need, emphasis on the reading, the writing, the arithmetics, the basics, but also a lot on ethics, innovation, history, cultural, intelligence about the different cultures that we have in Nigeria, we could leapfrog where we are. But yeah, that's a very complicated conversation because when you look at our budgets, we still don't meet what the required, there's the UNESCO recommendation of how much you should be spending in your budget on education. And there's also the one on health. We're not meeting those. So I would say education, but it's not a quick fix. This is something that you have to do, sustainably, intentionally for at least 20 years to start seeing the benefits. So for me, there's no quick fix, but, I don't know. What do you think? Are there quick fixes?
It is interesting that you ask me the question. It's interesting that you ask me the question, but I certainly cannot debate with you on the importance and the value of education. Both of us, neither of us will be on this program and having this conversation if we didn't have education, if we didn't have, a solid education. So I'm just wondering, though, thinking in many other areas, because the theme, as you most likely would have also noticed, is broad. When they say invest in women, people will say, what does that mean? Sure. How do we invest in women? You've highlighted one of the areas, but I also know that, this is not just talk for you. This is something that you have been very deeply involved with politically, socially, even speaking in the area of education, which you mentioned. I was really surprised, and I think I mentioned this to you, pleasantly surprised to see your name on the textbook of one of my daughters. And I was saying, oh, Ayisha is into everything,
Everything that doesn't bring money in the Nigerian palace, because writing textbooks, how much do you earn from that? But very, very passionate about history and social, which is tied to social studies, which is tied to governance and government studies. But yeah, you've caught me. Anywhere where there's books involved, yes, you will find me there, which is not necessarily where money is.
Yes, and I know that one of the places where you've also lent your voice is the fact that you write an opinion. You're not afraid to say what you think. I read you on the back page of leadership newspapers, and at the beginning of this year, you did write an opinion titled "Elections, Democracy," and I think something about where the world should be. More or less like an outlook, and the year ahead. That was elections, democracy, and the year ahead. Now, you did observe that 40% of the world will be going into elections. You observed that only 2 women seem to be serious contenders in the presidential elections of all of the countries going into the polls. Some people say we've made progress, but we're so far from where we ought to be. Why is this consistently the case?
I mean, that's a really tough question. I would like to start with saying, how much time do we have? But I think one key factor is it's culture, it's patriarchy. And I know it sounds really flippant, but if you look at the data, when you look at how well women do in the corporate sector, let's just use that for example, how well women do in the corporate sector, how well women do with business. In fact, even though we're investing in lower rates in stocks and things like that, there's actually data that shows that when we do invest, we actually do very well. So back to patriarchy, there's just a sense, and it's growing around the world as we contend with, I think, almost 17, 18 years of consistent rollback in democracy. So now the whole world is sort of agreed that we're in a democratic regression and authoritarianism is on the rise. Now, along with authoritarianism is linked to, feelings of nationalism, feelings of populism, and also even the feelings of going back to the past. So you find that many right-wing governments, many right-wing populists, when they're coming up, one of the things they attack most are women's rights, women's freedoms. They say, we should return to the tradition of the woman at home. So patriarchy does keep women back. Patriarchy does keep political parties from even recognizing that women are worthy candidates. If we come back home, leave global and come back home, you have 15 states in Nigeria that have not a single woman elected to their state assemblies, not one. From Abia to Osun to some in the north, Bauchi, Gombe, not a single woman. There's nothing beyond that, beyond patriarchy. And we can see it even in our constitution that sort of tends to say that women can't give the right of citizenship to men. Nigerian women who marry can't give their citizenship to men. That was something that we fought, and I think has finally just changed in the last National Assembly, the 9th one. So it is patriarchy around the world that's keeping women away. We can see how female candidates are always held to higher standards. We can use Hillary Clinton for all her flaws as an example of somebody who, on paper, if a man had that type of CV, they wouldn't be under the pressure that she was under, and ultimately she didn't pass. So I would say a very simple answer is just to say patriarchy. It's the culture, it's our culture, and we should be, through education, through socialization, fighting or trying to change that sense that women are inferior to men.
Yeah, it's a very, while you were speaking, my mind was just going to the fact that, for Western democracies, there's always that talk of right and left. And, it would seem that when we talk about women's rights, we tend to find them more with leftists, or we seem more liberal, sure. with women's rights when you're tilting more to the left. In places like Nigeria, where we do not have these dichotomies, and even in some instances, for instance, Margaret Thatcher, she was a Tory. So there are big questions as to, whether this discriminations, these dichotomies make any sense, especially in places like Nigeria, where our politics hasn't exactly progress to that level where we're talking about ideologies. We're still at a very basic level. Let me put it that way. We're still looking for food, shelter, and what are we looking for now? And clothing for our people, and electricity, and schools. Those kinds of basic social amenities is where we still are. We seem to have made more progress in the past with women at the forefront than now, when even many more women are educated. What exactly is going on?
Well, I think it's, again, you're right. So two things. You pointed out that in Nigeria, we don't do left and right. And in fact, I think most parts of the world, we don't do left and right. The idea of left and right is, well, maybe American, European, Latin American, they do left and right politics. I always say that when it comes to things like misogyny or just corruption, our parties are the same. They have no ideology. So they follow, whatever the power is.
Welcome back. You're watching Hard Copy, coming to you from our studios in Abuja. Our guest tonight is Ayisha Osori, who is a lawyer, author, commentator, and a director at the Open Society Foundations. Just before we went on break, Ayisha, you were talking about left and right.
When you come back to saying, why does it seem like, women are not doing well, even though more are being educated, it's still tied to what, I mentioned a few minutes ago about the fact that authoritarianism is on the rise. There are pushbacks to democracy. People are even contesting, what does democracy mean? Does it even mean the same thing to everybody? So when me and you talk about democracy, are we saying the same thing as maybe somebody else in Sri Lanka and India? People are beginning to contest what democracy is. People are linking democracy to just what you said, liberal rights, and they're pushing back on that. They're saying we don't want liberal rights, we want traditional. So all those things are creating what people are calling a polycrisis. It's multidimensional. It's very hard to say what's the thing, but there's lots of things happening socially, economically, that are seeing more women being pushed back into the homes. You can see lots of rights in terms of pro-choice, women's rights to their bodies, sexual reproductive health rights. All those things are being rolled back. So you can't disconnect one of them from this polycrisis. There's multiple layers to what is happening, and we need to have, and so again, that's another thing. So having one day to talk about this is really not enough. This should be an ongoing dialogue. If the women in our National Assembly and the men, because the truth is, women voted for these men as well. So these representatives, sometimes we put too much burden on the very few women who are in the National Assembly and, make them the water carriers for all our desires and our ambitions for women. But the truth is, the men, we voted for the men as well. So the men also owe it to us. But there should be an ongoing conversation every time we're talking about policy about where women should fit in. Nigeria is doing really, really badly when you look at the indices. When it comes to women's representation in National Assembly, we're like 6%. The average for Africa is 26%. We're like two countries. Like when you look at the list, maybe the list has 37, we're 35. So again, and you can see I feel like it's reflected in what we're seeing in Nigeria. Once upon a time in 2007, we had the highest number of women represented. We seemed like we were on an upward trajectory in Nigeria. The things that we're talking about today, whether it's the insecurity, the constant, again, I think 2 days ago, school attacks, girls kidnapped, all those things weren't happening before. Unfortunately, we don't seem to realize, or those in government and civil society and all of us in society don't seem to realize that the more we refuse to pay attention to the rights of women and girls, the more these issues of insecurity, because they're all linked. These kidnappers find that they want to take the most vulnerable, or the terrorists want to take women who will serve them, as slaves, people who will cook and clean. If you don't value the women in your society, then these types of groups, the terrorists, the kidnappers, will continue to erode whatever little space women have. And again, it's also counterintuitive, but I always say charity begins at home. So if government is our home, our father, our leader, I'm struggling a little bit to use those terms because I don't like those patriarchal terms, but if government doesn't hold the lives of women and girls in a special way, or doesn't recognize that they're vulnerable and need care, then nobody else will. It's the usual example you give. A guest comes to your house, sees the way you treat your children or your house help, they will immediately follow suit. So this degradation, this pushing away of women, it flows from somewhere else. But that said, I also like what you said, that women have been doing well. Maybe that's also another thing that we need to highlight as opposed to what's wrong. Maybe we need to be spending time. Yes, the numbers can seem dismal, but maybe we should also be spending time talking about what women are doing wonderfully well, and use opportunities like International Women's Day and other days to just sort of showcase women in different parts of society and what the value that they bring. And I think that would also help to change minds.
It's interesting you talk about, we talk about rights and very beautifully you're speaking with me from the United Kingdom, where a lot of young people have now jackpot too. And there is also
and old people
too. Oh wow. And I hope you're including yourself in that number.
For all, who knows why I'm here now? So technically, I could have jackpot as well. Everybody who's not in Nigeria might have jackpot from Nigeria.
Well, anyways, I just find, increasingly we're seeing on social media this, I don't want to call it culture shock, but that, experiences that people are now beginning to share increasingly. Some of them are now beginning to say, look, if I see one more Nigerian sharing an experience, it's enough, experience your experience and keep quiet. But then we see also that families, homes have been, let's say some of them are experiencing a different angle to how, the rules work there. And some people think, oh no, that's not what we aspire to for our society. While we want to be able to look after women and will not tolerate violence, etc., they think that, the standards over there are too extreme. In terms of the protection of women. So where do you think the balance should lie? Should we be aspiring to that? What standards should we be looking at in terms of what a society should be doing to empower and protect its women?
I'll say, first of all, that we should be aspiring to a new future generally. We shouldn't be looking at the West for our standards. I would say that. At the same time, we cannot be looking only purely at our past, because I could say, for example, I think there's a very interesting theory pushed by people like Professor Oyewumi, where they say Yoruba don't do gender. Then you have matrilineal societies in Ghana. So it's the West are not setting any standards for us. In fact, some people will argue that when the colonialists came, whether it was the Portuguese or the British with the religion, with Christianity, they eroded the rights that women had. Like, so as a Muslim woman, for example, you don't need to change your name to your husband's name. That's actually quite progressive, something that the West doesn't do. So I wouldn't say, should we be aspiring to the standards of the West? I would say we should be looking at our own society and saying what would work best for all of us. Based on the fact that we have different cultures, we're a very multicultural society, we have ethnic diversity, religious diversity, what would work for us? We should be trying to invent the new, not either looking back to with, romantic eyes, making it seem like everything was wonderful in the past. But at the same time, we cannot also be setting our standards by the West. We should be designing our own. And so speaking of these rights, there's an understanding about why these protections for these women exist. And even despite the protections that we have for women, whether it's in terms of divorce and separation and who gets the house and, all those things that are very quite progressive, they still struggle even here. They still struggle with, it's not perfect. You still find that even the structures, whether it's the policemen, and we've heard those horrible stories of policemen who are rapists, who are murderers, you still have structural inequalities towards women, but they are trying. And I think the lesson for us there is not to just say, we're going to adopt these whole scale. Is to say what will work for us. But those are the conversations, again, that we're not having enough of.
Mm-hmm. Well, you talked about elections very briefly when you talked about the National Assembly, but we've noticed, as you also have noted in some of your comments, that elections are becoming even more polarizing in nature. And the goals in these elections are becoming increasingly difficult to close after elections. Do you see a role for women here?
In what? In closing the election loops, or
yes, the goals after the elections is helping to heal.
Yeah. Do we see a role here? Well, women can take a role anywhere. This is a good question because it means I haven't thought about it. That is there a role for women to play in closing the gap after elections? I would say that the women are as polarized. If the women's groups that I'm part of, oh my God, are anything to go by, we are as adamant, and I'm adding myself, because even just yesterday I said, people are saying the elections are over, move on. And I'm like, nope, the elections are not over, because, elections are just one element of a democracy or a functioning society, and that we've chosen to do. And we want people to know that the votes that you make on one day will have repercussions for, in fact, beyond even an election cycle, because people in power will do things, they will set in course different things that will affect you and your children in the future. So no, so I was just saying that yesterday. So I'm saying, I don't know that women in particular will have a special role to play, but if it's a role that women decide that they want to play, then it would be a very good role, because women have played that role in societies where there's been war. So we can talk about Liberia, Sierra Leone, the whole women coming together to make sure that the war ended. So women do have power in terms of negotiating peace. And if that's a role that Nigerian women want to play, I think they would play it really well. We have strong associations, whether it's professional ones like FIDA, whether it's alumni associations, whether it's religious like the Catholic women. We have very strong women. That's the truth. It's just when it doesn't translate easily into the public sphere, it's usually more on the social, on the political sphere. It's usually more on the social level that we have those strengths.
It'll be interesting to see how that eventually can come into the political space. But Ayisha, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this discussion. I have to thank you for coming on Hard Copy tonight, and happy International Women's Day to you once more.
Happy International Women's Day to you too, Mapwe, and to all our audience and viewers. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure. Have a good weekend.
You too. That's the program tonight. But your feedback is always important to us, so please speak with us using the handles showing on your screen. Thank you for watching. I'm Malkwe Ogun Yusuf. Good night.